Welcome to the framework overview for Unit 4, Global Interactions, circa 1450 to 1750. Remember, this video is organized around the framework, which looks like this. And I'm going to try to explain some key points here, but remember, it's just an overview, and you should use it as an opportunity to remind yourself of some key concepts and use your course resources, chapter notes, work that we've done for more details. There's three concepts in this unit, and the first is called Globalizing Networks of Communication and Exchange, and this is the biggest one in the unit, and we'll be looking at the following key concepts: intensification of trade networks, developments in technology, maritime reconnaissance, the global circulation of goods, the Columbian Exchange, spread and reform of existing religions, and funding for the arts. So this part here is about the increasing globalization and the efforts of Europe, especially as they look for new trade opportunities and the causes and effects of those connections. Starting with the intensification of existing regional trade networks. This is about the merchants and the governments benefiting and sometimes suffering from these trade networks. But this is a reminder that a lot of these trade networks that we focused on last unit, like the Indian Ocean trade network, are continuing. So we have the Indian Ocean, we have sea routes in the Mediterranean, especially with Venice, which is shown here in the blue arrows. We have the Trans-Saharan trade network continuing, and trade overland in Eurasia. I use the Silk Roads map, which is really from Unit 3, and remember, after the Mongols, the Silk Roads kind of dies out a little bit, but it's the best map that the book had, and really just remember that there is still trade happening overland in Eurasia. The Silk Roads being a relay trade network means that just because we don't talk about the Silk Roads as this huge network shown here in this red lines, doesn't mean there's not trade happening overland in Eurasia. Okay, next is about developments in technology, and this globalization could not have happened if there had not been some improvements in technology such as navigation. And the first is new tools in cartography, such as the Waldseemüller map from 1507. And this is shortly after the voyages of Columbus, and it's a map that helped the Europeans navigate around the world. And if you look at the map here on the far left, we have the conception of South and North America, which looks primitive to our eyes, but for 1507 definitely shows European advanced understanding of how to navigate around the world. The next heading is about reconnaissance or exploration across oceans, and we have, of course, the voyages of Zhang He, shown in this map with the blue arrows. And the next example is the Portuguese trading post empire, shown in this map in orange, in the west coast and east coast of Africa. And remember, those were made possible by the voyages of Vasco da Gama around Africa in an effort to find a route to Asia and the trade riches there that did not rely on Muslim control of the overland routes from Europe to Asia. Moving on, of course, we have the Spanish sponsorship of the voyages of Columbus, which led to the Columbian Exchange, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we also have crossings higher up in the North Atlantic, primarily for fishing and settlements that would eventually lead to the fur trade, but were one of the original motivations for the colonies in North America. And finally, a reminder that in Oceania, the trade networks were not affected by the European exploration. This area here definitely had its own trade networks developed. Down here in this map, this is Yap, which was the example that we looked at. But just a reminder that globalization is not literally the entire world at this point. The next heading looks at the global circulation of goods and the involvement of the governments of Europe in chartering companies that helped facilitate trade around the world. So first, a reminder that in Asia, Europeans participated in the Asian trade but did not dominate it during this unit. China is really still the dominant country, and that what Europeans did was transfer goods from one place to another within Asia, and often at the mercy of Chinese, especially with the silver trade, which we'll get to in a minute. And here it is here, and this section reminds us that it was silver that was kind of the driving force of the commercialization and globalization of the trade during this time period. The next heading looks at the Columbian Exchange, and there's quite a bit of sub-bullets about it. A reminder of the spread of diseases, and also the exchange of crops from the Americas to Europe, and also from Europe to the Americas. And that there were populations in Afro-Eurasia that grew because of the nutritional benefit of these new crops, and also the negative effects on the Americas, both demographically in terms of the numbers of people who died, and also the environmental effects of deforestation and soil erosion. So check your framework for more detail about the Columbian Exchange. Next, a reminder that Islam continues to spread. Here are some examples of 4 Islamic empires during this time period. Christianity is reformed with the Protestant Reformation. On this map, the predominantly Protestant areas of Europe are in orange, and the lighter orange is some Protestant, and the purple is Catholic. So remember, Christianity in Western Europe is split during this time period. And we have a reminder that Buddhism continues to spread in Asia. On this map, Buddhism is in kind of a brownish color here. And please notice that in India, the home of Buddhism, it is primarily Islamic at this time period. And finally, a reminder of syncretic forms of religion, which is the blending of two or more traditions to form a new one. And our example was Sikhism. And this picture from your textbook is Guru Nanak, who was the creator of Sikhism as an effort to unite or synthesize the Muslim and Hindu faiths. And the last heading in this section is about funding for the arts, as these governments increased financially and politically, both with Renaissance art and with literature. And your literature example was the Shakespeare studying you did in your English class. Okay, the next heading, Concept 2, is about new forms of social organization and modes of production. And we'll be looking at the demand for labor and ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies. First, about the demand for labor. We start with the use of peasant labor, and as Russia expanded, remember that peasant labor was kind of provided the backbone, and especially in terms of agricultural labor, providing a food source for the expanding population and empire of Russia. And then we also have some information about the slave trade. And check the framework because there's several bullets about the slave trade. Most people focus on the transatlantic slave trade for good reason, which is shown here with these red arrows. But don't forget that there was a slave trade within Africa. There's a trans-Saharan slave trade shown right here, going into Europe. And there is still an East African slave trade going across the Indian Ocean this way into Asia. So again, check the framework for those examples. The next 2 bullets about the demand for labor are about labor systems in America, such as the Mitah, and the use of coerced labor in Europe, such as indentured servants. Next, we have the fact that new elites started to form in certain countries as a source of power. And remember that the Qing dynasty in China was dominated by Manchus, who were an ethnic group from the north. Their homeland is called Manchuria here. So for the Chinese, the Manchu dynasty is another foreign dynasty in the way that the Mongol dynasty was. We also have the fact that some elites had their power fluctuate. This is the time period when the power of the daimyo in Japan is challenged at various times. And also the demographic changes that happened due to the slave trades in terms of family roles changing and being restructured as well. And finally, we have new classifications in the Americas, such as the Mestizo, Mulatto, and Creole groups. The last key concept is called state consolidation and imperial expansion. This is sort of the political one, and the concepts we'll be looking at in some more detail are: how did rulers legitimize and consolidate power? How did these empires expand? And what challenges the states faced as they either consolidated or expanded? First, starting with legitimizing and consolidating power. There were displays of power to demonstrate the strength of the government, such as the court sponsorship of literature like Shakespeare, and in some cases religious efforts to legitimize the empires, such as the use of divine right in Europe, and here in this picture, the Aztec use of human sacrifice. We also have the fact that some states limited the ability of ethnic groups to challenge their authority, such as the way the Ottomans treated non-Muslims. We have recruiting elites, such as the samurai in Japan, the devshirme in Ottoman Empire, or the examination system in China, helping to maintain control in terms of creating an elite class that is dependent on the government for its power and helps to reinforce it. And the use of tribute collection, and that is also a source not only of money for the government, but also reinforcing its power. Next, imperial expansion. There's a section about the development of trading post empires during this time period, and the fact that they were continued because they were profitable for rulers. So we mentioned the Portuguese in orange on this map earlier, but don't forget that the Dutch here in purple, and the Spanish here in green also had trading post empires. And this map doesn't show it, but remember the British began with trading post empires in India and eventually ended up taking over the entire country and defeating the Mughal Empire. We also have the expansion of land empires during this time period, and there are several examples. So we have the Manchu or Qing dynasty expanding China during this time period. We have the expansion of the Russian Empire, the expansion of the Mughal Empire, and finally the Ottoman Empire, which is shown here expanding throughout the time period. If you look on this map, this brown section, it's hard to see, is described as the core Ottoman region, and then it expands all the way, including the purple, and the orange are the tributary states, another example of the collection of tribute. And finally, for this section, we have the development of new maritime empires in the Americas. So if you look at this map, you've got the Dutch in purple right here. You've got the English in green, primarily, of course, in the eastern part of what is now the United States, and also up north here in Canada. You have the French, which is much of the rest of the United States, and then you have the Spanish and the Portuguese splitting up what we now call Latin America. And the last couple of challenges the framework reviews are competition over trade routes like piracy in the Caribbean, state rivalries that were a challenge to this process, such as the 30 Years' War, and finally, in some cases, local resistance to this expansion. So a quick visual summary for the framework. It's called Global Interactions, 1450 to 1750. The three main headings are networks of exchange, social and economic organization, and political power. And really, one way to think about this framework is that in each of those, all these developments really just focus on the causes and effects of those three components of the unit. That's your overview for Unit 4. Happy studying!